It was a cold, dreary morning when Officer James Carter's routine patrol took a turn he'd never forget. The sun barely peeked through the grey clouds as he navigated the quiet back streets of his neighborhood, sipping lukewarm coffee from a travel mug. The streets, still damp from last night's rain, glistened faintly under the dim light. It was supposed to be another uneventful shift in a town where not much ever happened, or so he thought. As James rolled down a narrow alley behind an old apartment complex, something unusual caught his attention. A faint, muffled sound rose above the distant hum of passing cars. He slowed his cruiser and listened carefully. Was it a cat? Maybe someone left their radio on nearby. But as he turned off the engine, the sound became unmistakable. It wasn't a cat. It was a baby crying. His heart quickened. Babies didn't belong in alleys. James stepped out of his car, his boots crunching on the wet gravel as he followed the cries, now growing louder and more desperate. The noise pulled him toward a large, overflowing dumpster tucked behind the building. A wave of disbelief swept over him. It couldn't be. He forced himself to move closer, his pulse pounding in his ears. When he lifted the heavy, rusted lid, the sight before him froze him in place. There, amid the filth and discarded trash bags, was a tiny, crying baby, a little girl wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket. Her skin was dark, her cheeks streaked with tears, and her wide, terrified eyes stared up at him, silently pleading for help. She was so small, so fragile, that it seemed impossible she'd survived even this long. "Dear God," James whispered, his voice shaking as he gently reached down to lift her out of the dumpster. The baby shivered in his arms, her cries softening just slightly as if sensing she was finally safe. The blanket offered little warmth, and James quickly removed his own jacket, wrapping it around her trembling body. His mind raced with questions. Who would do this? How long had she been there? And most importantly, could she be saved? He rushed back to his cruiser, cradling the baby close to his chest, and radioed for backup and medical assistance. "This is Officer Carter. I need an ambulance at my location immediately," he said, his voice firm despite the panic bubbling inside him. The dispatcher responded swiftly, but James barely heard the words. His focus was entirely on the little girl in his arms, her fragile breaths and tiny fingers clutching his sleeve. As the ambulance arrived and paramedics took over, James couldn't shake the image of her frightened eyes. He followed them to the hospital, unable to let her go, even though his shift was long over. While doctors worked to stabilize her, James paced the waiting room, replaying the scene in his mind. How could someone abandon such an innocent life? Hours later, a nurse emerged, informing him that the baby, now cleaned, fed, and resting, would survive. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The nurse's next words cut through him like a blade. "We haven't been able to find any information about her parents. She'll likely end up in the system unless someone comes forward." James looked through the glass at the tiny infant, now sleeping peacefully in a hospital bassinet. Something stirred deep within him, a fierce, protective instinct he didn't fully understand. He didn't know it then, but that moment would change his life forever. Years passed, and the little girl, whom he named Grace, became the center of James's world. He'd eventually adopted her, raising her as his own. She grew up in a loving home, and though the scars of her early days lingered, Grace thrived. But just when James thought he understood the story of that fateful day in the alley, a revelation from Grace's past would shake everything he believed. What he uncovered years later would challenge his faith, his understanding of love, and the very bond he shared with the daughter he had saved. James never saw himself as a father. His life had been dedicated to his badge and the community he served. He wasn't married, and his quiet home reflected his simple, solitary lifestyle. But the moment he brought Grace home from a hospital, everything changed. His once orderly world was now filled with soft cries, tiny bottles, and the hum of lullabies playing from an old speaker in the corner of his living room. He didn't mind, though. If anything, he welcomed it. Grace brought warmth and purpose to a life that, until then, had been defined by routine and duty. Caring for a baby wasn't easy, especially for someone like James, who had no experience raising a child. He read every parenting book he could get his hands on, sought advice from coworkers, and even reached out to his older sister, Diane, who had raised 2 kids of her own. Grace quickly became the focus of his world. Every milestone, her first smile, her first steps, her first words, felt like a miracle. He cherished every moment, grateful that fate had led him to that alley on that cold morning. As Grace grew, her personality blossomed. She was curious, clever, and fiercely independent. Her laughter filled the house, and her boundless energy kept James on his toes. But he couldn't ignore the questions that lingered in the back of his mind. Who had abandoned her? Why had they left her in such a cruel and dangerous place? He knew the answers were out there, but he had no leads, no clues to follow. Every time he looked into Grace's big, bright eyes, he wondered about the life she had been born into, and the one she narrowly escaped. Despite the mystery surrounding her past, James focused on giving Grace the best life he could. He made sure she knew she was loved, that she belonged, and that she was safe. But even with his unwavering love and dedication, James couldn't shield her from the world's harsh realities. By the time Grace started school, she began to notice the differences between herself and other children. Her skin was darker than James's, and people often asked questions that made her feel like she didn't quite fit in. "Why don't I look like you, Daddy?" she asked one evening, her voice small and hesitant as they sat together on the couch. James paused, setting down the book he'd been reading. He had always known this question would come, but it still caught him off guard. He took a deep breath, pulling her close. "You're special, Grace," he said softly. "You're my daughter, and I love you more than anything in the world. Families don't always look the same, but what matters is the love we share. That's what makes us a family." She nodded, though James could see the wheels turning in her young mind. He knew there would be more questions in the future, and he vowed to always be honest with her, even when the truth was difficult. As the years went on, Grace continued to thrive. She excelled in school, made friends easily, and developed a love for art that filled their home with vibrant drawings and paintings. James encouraged her passions, proud of the young woman she was becoming. But he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that her past would one day resurface. He tried to prepare himself for that moment, though he had no idea how or when it would come. It was on Grace's 13th birthday that the first crack in their carefully built life appeared. James had planned a small celebration at home, just the 2 of them. He had baked a cake, slightly lopsided but made with love, and decorated the living room with streamers and balloons. Grace had been thrilled, laughing as James sang "Happy Birthday" off-key. But later that evening, as they cleaned up the remnants of the party, Grace brought up a topic James had hoped to avoid. "Daddy, do you think I'll ever know who my real parents are?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. James froze, the dish he was drying slipping from his hands and clattering into the sink. He turned to face her, his heart sinking. He saw the determination in her eyes, the same determination that had driven her to excel in everything she did. He knew he couldn't brush her off. "I don't know, sweetheart," he admitted, his voice gentle. "But if that's something you want to explore, I'll support you. We'll do it together." Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I love you, Daddy," she said, hugging him tightly. "You're my family, no matter what." Her words brought him some comfort, but James knew that this was only the beginning. The questions she was asking wouldn't stop, and he couldn't protect her from the answers they might uncover. Over the next few weeks, Grace became increasingly curious about her origins. She asked about the day James found her, and he told her everything he could remember, leaving out only the most painful details. She listened intently, her eyes wide, as he described the moment he heard her cries in the alley. For James, reliving that day brought back a flood of emotions, fear, anger, and gratitude that he had been in the right place at the right time. But Grace's curiosity didn't end there. She wanted to know more. James reached out to the hospital where she had been treated, hoping to find any records or clues that might shed light on her early days. He contacted the police department, searching for any reports or leads that had been overlooked. But no matter how hard he tried, the answers remained elusive. Then one afternoon, while James was at work, Grace stumbled upon something that would change everything. She had been rummaging through a box of old photographs and documents in the attic, hoping to find more pieces of her story. Instead, she found an envelope tucked away in the bottom of the box, its edges yellowed with age. Inside was a letter, handwritten and addressed to James. The contents of that letter would shake the foundation of their lives, unraveling the carefully constructed world they had built together. Grace didn't understand all of it at first, but the words hinted at secrets James had never shared. When he returned home that evening, she handed him the letter, her hands trembling. "Daddy," she said quietly, "what is this?" James stared at the letter in disbelief, his face pale as he read the familiar handwriting. The past he had tried so hard to leave behind was finally catching up to him, and he knew there was no turning back. As he folded the letter and set it down on the table, he looked at Grace, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had to tell her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of love and fear. And with those words, the mystery of Grace's past deepened, drawing them both into a story far more complex and far more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. James sat across from Grace at the dining room table, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. The letter lay between them like a ticking time bomb. Grace's wide eyes searched his face for answers, and James felt the weight of her trust pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, his fingers running through his graying hair as he tried to piece together how to begin. "That letter," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's from someone who claimed to know something about the day I found you. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't share it with you because I didn't think it would lead anywhere. I wanted to protect you." Grace frowned, her hands clenched in her lap. "Protect me from what?" "The truth." Her voice was steady but tinged with frustration. "I'm not a little kid anymore, Dad. I deserve to know." James nodded, feeling the sting of her words. She was right, she did deserve to know. But the truth was complicated, and he wasn't sure where to start. He reached for the letter, unfolding it slowly, his hands trembling as he began to read it aloud. The letter was brief but chilling. It was from someone who claimed to have seen the person who abandoned Grace that day in the alley. The writer, who didn't sign their name, provided vague details. A man in a dark coat, a hurried exchange of words, and then silence as the baby was left behind. There was no return address, no way to verify the information. At the time, James had dismissed it as a cruel prank or a baseless rumor. Now, seeing the look in Grace's eyes, he regretted not pursuing it further. Grace leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Did you ever try to find out who wrote this?" "I did, briefly," James admitted. "I asked around, but without more details, there wasn't much to go on. It felt like a dead end, and I thought it was better to let it go." Grace didn't respond immediately. She stared at the letter, her mind racing with possibilities. Who was the man in the dark coat? Was he her father? Or someone else entirely? The questions swirled in her head, each one more unsettling than the last. She looked up at James, determination in her eyes. "I want to find out," she said firmly. "I need to know who they are and why they left me." James felt his stomach drop. He had spent years trying to shield Grace from the pain of her past, but now it was clear she wouldn't rest until she had answers, and he couldn't blame her. He saw the fire in her, the same fire that had driven her to excel in school, to chase her passions, and to face every challenge with unwavering resolve. She was strong, stronger than he had given her credit for. "Okay," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "We'll look into it, but I need you to promise me something. If things get too hard, if the answers aren't what you hoped for, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this." Grace nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I promise." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of research and dead ends. James reached out to old colleagues, digging through files and records from that time, hoping to find any overlooked details. Grace scoured the internet, searching for news articles or posts that might provide clues. They even visited the alley where she had been found, hoping to jog James' memory or spot something they had missed. But the mystery only deepened. One night, while sifting through old police reports, James found a name that caught his attention. A man named Marcus Bell had been questioned around the time Grace was found. He was a known petty criminal with a history of loitering in the area. At the time, there hadn't been enough evidence to connect him to Grace's abandonment, but James couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus might know more than he let on. James shared the lead with Grace, and together, they tracked down Marcus's last known address. It was a rundown apartment building on the outskirts of town. As they approached, James's protective instincts kicked into high gear. He insisted Grace stay in the car while he went inside, but she refused, her resolve unshaken. The building smelled of mildew and stale smoke, the dim hallway lit by a flickering bulb. James knocked on the door of Marcus' apartment, his fist firm but cautious. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a man with sunken eyes and a scruffy beard. He looked wary, his gaze shifting between James and Grace. "Marcus Bell?" James asked, his voice steady. "Who's asking?" Marcus replied, his tone defensive. "I'm Officer James Carter," James said, flashing his badge. "We need to talk." Marcus hesitated, but eventually stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The apartment was cluttered, the air thick with the smell of old food and cigarette smoke. Marcus slumped into a worn-out chair, eyeing them warily. "What's this about?" he asked. James didn't mince words. "Years ago, a baby girl was abandoned in an alley near here. You were questioned at the time but never charged. We're trying to find out what happened." Marcus's expression darkened. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "I don't know anything about no baby." Grace stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Please, Mr. Bell, that baby was me. I just want to know the truth." For a moment, something flickered in Marcus's eyes, guilt, perhaps, or recognition. He sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look," he said finally, "I didn't leave no baby in no alley. But I saw something that night. A man tall, wearing a black coat, like the letter said. He was talking to a woman. She looked scared, real scared. They were arguing. Next thing I know, he's gone, and she's running out of there. I didn't stick around to see the rest." "Who was the woman?" James pressed. Marcus shook his head. "I don't know her name. Never seen her before or since." The information was frustratingly vague, but it was more than they had before. As they left the apartment, James couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was holding something back. Grace, meanwhile, seemed both hopeful and anxious. They were getting closer to the truth, but the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty. Later that night, as they sat together in the living room, Grace looked at James, her eyes filled with determination. "We can't stop now," she said. "We're so close." James nodded, though his heart ached with worry. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it seemed, but he couldn't let Grace face it alone. Together, they would uncover the secrets of her past, no matter where the journey led. The days that followed felt like a blur. James couldn't stop thinking about Marcus' account of that night, about the mysterious man in the black coat and the frightened woman. Who were they? What had driven them to that alley? More than anything, James wondered if they were still out there, living their lives as if nothing had happened, while Grace carried the weight of their decisions every single day. Grace, too, was restless. She spent hours combing through online archives, newspapers and forums, searching for anything that might tie back to the description Marcus had given. James tried to convince her to slow down, to take a break, but she was relentless. She was so close to the answers she had spent her whole life yearning for, and nothing could stop her now. One evening, as James was finishing dinner, Grace burst into the kitchen, her laptop clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes were wide, and her breath came in quick bursts. "Dad, I found something," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. James set down his fork and turned to her. "What is it?" She placed the laptop on the table and pointed to an old article she had uncovered. The headline read, "Local woman missing after mysterious disappearance." The article was dated just a few weeks before Grace had been found. It described a woman named Carla Matthews who had been reported missing under suspicious circumstances. Witnesses claimed she had been seen arguing with an unidentified man shortly before she vanished. The description of the man matched what Marcus had told them: tall, wearing a black coat. "She was scared," Grace said, her voice cracking. "Just like Marcus said. What if she's my mother?" James leaned back in his chair, processing the information. The timeline fit, and the details were too close to ignore. But if Carla Matthews was Grace's mother, why hadn't she come forward? Where had she gone? And what role did the man in the black coat play in all of this? "We need to find out more," James said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. They began digging deeper into Carla Matthews' life. She had worked as a waitress at a diner downtown and was described as kind but reserved. She kept to herself and rarely spoke about her personal life. There were no records of her having children, but that didn't mean much. If she had been hiding a pregnancy or running from someone, it would explain the secrecy. James and Grace visited the diner where Carla had worked, hoping to find someone who remembered her. The place was old and a little run down, with faded booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. The manager, an older man named Frank, greeted them cautiously when they explained why they were there. "Carla Matthews," he said, scratching his chin. "Yeah, I remember her. Sweet girl, hard worker. She disappeared out of nowhere, though. One day she was here, the next day, gone." "Did she ever talk about her life outside of work?" James asked. Frank shook his head. "Not much. She was pretty private. But I do remember her getting a lot of visits from some guy. Tall, always wore a dark coat. He gave me the creeps." Grace's heart raced. "Do you remember his name?" "No," Frank said, frowning. "But they argued a lot. She seemed scared of him. I told her she could tell me if she needed help, but she never did. I wish I'd pushed harder." As they left the diner, Grace felt a mixture of hope and dread. They were uncovering pieces of the puzzle, but the picture it painted was dark and unsettling. If Carla had been her mother, she had likely been in serious trouble, and the man in the black coat, whoever he was, seemed to be at the center of it all. The tension only grew when James received a phone call later that night. It was from a former colleague, a retired detective named Hank, who had worked with him around the time Grace was found. Hank had heard through the grapevine about James's search and wanted to help. "I think I might have something for you," Hank said, his voice gruff but kind. "I came across an old case file a while back. It didn't seem connected at the time, but now I'm not so sure." James and Grace met Hank at his home the next day. The detective handed James a thick file, the edges worn from years of storage. Inside were photos, reports, and notes about a series of suspicious incidents that had occurred in the same area where Grace had been found. One of the incidents involved a car abandoned near the alley, registered to none other than Carla Matthews. "She was running from someone," Hank said, his tone grim. "And it looks like she didn't make it far." Grace stared at the photos, her heart pounding. The car had been found empty, with no signs of a struggle inside, but there were traces of blood near the driver's side door. It was a chilling discovery, one that raised more questions than answers. "Did they ever figure out what happened to her?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank shook his head. "No, the case went cold. No body, no witnesses, nothing to go on." James felt a surge of anger and frustration. How could someone disappear so completely? And why had no one connected Carla to the baby found just weeks later? As they drove home, Grace was silent, staring out the window as rain drizzled against the glass. James could see the weight of it all pressing down on her. He reached over, squeezing her hand gently. "We'll figure this out," he said. "I promise." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into dangerous territory. The closer they got to the truth, the more it seemed to slip through their fingers. And the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that someone didn't want them to find the answers they were looking for. The rain continued to fall in a steady rhythm, drumming softly on the roof as James and Grace pulled into their driveway. Neither of them spoke, the weight of the new information settling heavily in the space between them. James could sense that Grace was lost in thought, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of hair. She had always been resilient, but this journey was testing her in ways neither of them had anticipated. Inside, the house felt colder than usual, the air thick with unspoken tension. Grace sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old case file Hank had given them. James watched her from across the room, debating whether to push her to rest or let her keep digging. Before he could decide, Grace suddenly looked up, her eyes wide with realization. "Dad," she said, her voice urgent. "The car. The one Carla left behind. It had blood near the door, right? What if there's still evidence in the file? Something they missed?" James nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure where she was going with this. "It's possible. But that car was impounded years ago. I doubt there's anything left of it now." Grace's expression hardened with determination. "We have to try. What if they overlooked something that could lead us to her, or to him?" She didn't need to explain who him was. The man in the black coat had become a shadow looming over everything, a faceless figure who held the answers they so desperately sought. Reluctantly, James agreed to reach out to Hank again, hoping the retired detective might have some ideas. Meanwhile, Grace dove back into her research, poring over every scrap of information she could find about Carla and the mysterious incidents surrounding her disappearance. It was late that night, long after James had gone to bed, when Grace stumbled across something that made her blood run cold. It was an obscure blog post from a true crime enthusiast, written years ago. The post detailed a pattern of disappearances that had occurred in the region around the same time Carla had vanished. Most of the cases were unrelated, but one detail stood out. A witness in one of the incidents had described seeing a man in a black coat leaving the scene. The description was eerily similar to Marcus' account and Frank's recollection at the diner. But it was what the blogger mentioned next that sent a chill down Grace's spine. The man had been spotted again, years later, in a town just a few hours away. This time, he was seen near another woman who had gone missing. The case had never been solved, but the connection was undeniable. Grace's hands shook as she printed the article, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this man responsible for Carla's disappearance? And if so, how many others had he hurt? The next morning, Grace showed the article to James, who read it with a growing sense of unease. The coincidences were too strong to ignore, and the idea that this man might still be out there filled James with a mixture of anger and dread. He knew they couldn't let this lead slip away, no matter how dangerous it might be. With Hank's help, they tracked down the name of the lead investigator on the missing woman's case. Detective Claire Bennett was still active in law enforcement, working in the same town where the sighting had occurred. James reached out to her, explaining their situation and sharing the details they had uncovered. To his surprise, Claire was more than willing to help. She, too, had been haunted by the unsolved case and was eager to see if there was a connection to Carla. Claire met with James and Grace in person, bringing with her a thick folder of notes and evidence from her investigation. As they sifted through the files together, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The man in the black coat had been seen not just twice, but multiple times over the years, always near women who would later disappear. He seemed to operate in the shadows, leaving behind little evidence, but always stirring the same sense of fear and unease. "I've always believed he was a predator," Claire said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "Someone who knows how to avoid detection. But if we can link him to Carla or to Grace, we might finally be able to bring him to justice." As they worked late into the night, piecing together the fragments of the mystery, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was irrational, he told himself, just the paranoia of a father who had spent too many sleepless nights worrying about his daughter. But when they returned home, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The porch light was off. James was certain he had left it on before they left. He didn't say anything to Grace, not wanting to alarm her, but his hand instinctively went to the holster at his side. He pushed open the front door cautiously, scanning the room for anything out of place. Everything seemed normal, until he saw the envelope on the kitchen table. It hadn't been there when they left. James's heart pounded as he approached the table, his eyes fixed on the envelope. His name was scrawled across the front in messy handwriting, and the sight of it filled him with a sense of foreboding. Grace stepped closer, her breath catching as she realized what he was holding. "Dad, what is that?" James didn't answer. He tore open the envelope, his hands shaking as he unfolded the letter inside. The message was brief, written in the same messy handwriting. Asterisk, you should have left it alone. Stop looking, or you'll regret it. Asterisk. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. James felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. Someone was trying to scare them, to keep them from uncovering the truth. But instead of backing down, it only strengthened his resolve. "We're not stopping," he said firmly, crumpling the letter in his fist. "No matter what they try to do, we're going to find out the truth." Grace nodded, but James could see the fear in her eyes. He knew they were venturing into dangerous territory, but there was no turning back now. The stakes had never been higher, and the answers they sought were closer than ever. But as they prepared to face whatever lay ahead, neither of them could have anticipated the shocking revelations that awaited them. The warning in the letter only deepened James and Grace's determination. They knew they were close to uncovering the truth, and nothing, not fear, not threats, was going to stop them. With Detective Claire Bennett's help, they focused on tracking the man in the black coat. Claire had access to databases and resources that James couldn't obtain on his own, and together they followed every lead, piecing together the man's movements over the years. It was Claire who finally found the breakthrough. Using a combination of witness statements and surveillance footage from years ago, she identified a man named Raymond Ellis, a drifter with a history of minor offenses. His name had never come up in the original investigations, but Claire found a troubling pattern. Wherever Raymond went, women seemed to vanish. He had lived in the area at the time of Carla Matthews' disappearance and had worked briefly at a construction site not far from the alley where Grace was found. Grace felt her stomach twist when Claire showed them a grainy photo of Raymond taken from an old driver's license. Even in the blurry image, his eyes were cold, his expression empty. "That's him," Grace whispered, her voice shaking. "It has to be." With this new lead, they intensified their efforts, tracking Raymond's last known location to a remote cabin in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. Claire insisted on bringing backup, but James was too invested to stay behind. He couldn't let Claire and her team confront Raymond alone. Grace begged to come along, but James refused, his protective instincts taking over. He left her with Diane, his sister, promising to call the moment they had answers. The drive to the cabin was tense, the air in the car heavy with anticipation. Claire and her team briefed James on the plan. Approach cautiously, assess the situation, and avoid any unnecessary risks. But as they neared the cabin, something about the stillness of the area sent a chill down James's spine. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their tires. They parked a distance away and approached on foot, their movements careful and deliberate. The cabin came into view, its windows dark, the wooden structure worn and weathered by time. Claire signaled for silence as they surrounded the building. One officer knocked on the door, his voice firm as he announced their presence. "Raymond Ellis, this is the police. Come out with your hands up." For a moment, there was nothing. Then the sound of movement inside, a heavy thud, followed by the scrape of a chair. The door creaked open, and Raymond stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. He didn't look surprised, but there was an edge to his expression that set James on high alert. "What do you want?" Raymond asked, his voice low and gravelly. Claire stepped forward, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. We need to ask you some questions about Carla Matthews and the child found in the alley not far from where you worked." At the mention of Carla, Raymond's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but James caught it. "I don't know anything about that," Raymond said, his tone flat. "I've got nothing to say." Claire's team wasn't buying it. They pressed further, questioning him about his whereabouts, his connection to Carla, and his suspicious movements over the years. Raymond's answers were evasive, his demeanor growing more agitated with every passing minute. Finally, Claire nodded to her team, signaling that it was time to search the cabin. As they entered, James felt a sense of unease. The cabin was sparse, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and stale cigarettes. But it was the small details that made his skin crawl. A collection of women's jewelry scattered on a shelf, a stack of old newspapers featuring missing persons cases, and most chilling of all, a faded photo pinned to the wall, a photo of Carla Matthews. James's stomach turned as he stared at the image. Carla looked young, her face tense, as if she had been caught off guard. It was clear now that Raymond knew her, despite his denials. But what had happened between them? And where had Carla gone after that photo was taken? Then came the discovery that brought everything into focus. One of Claire's officers opened a locked chest in the corner of the room, revealing a collection of documents, photos, and a single heartbreaking item, a baby blanket, old but unmistakably familiar. It was the same pattern as the one Grace had been wrapped in when James found her. James's vision blurred as anger surged through him. "What did you do to her?" he demanded, turning to Raymond. "What did you do to Carla?" Raymond sneered, his calm facade finally cracking. "She was weak," he said, his voice venomous. "She couldn't handle what needed to be done." James lunged forward, but Claire held him back. "We'll get him," she said firmly, "but not like this." Raymond was taken into custody, and as the investigation unfolded, the horrifying truth came to light. Carla had been trying to escape Raymond, who had been controlling and abusive. She had planned to leave town and start a new life with her baby, but Raymond had found her first. During a confrontation, Carla had managed to flee, leaving Grace in the alley in a desperate attempt to save her. Raymond had chased her, and though there was no definitive evidence of what happened next, the blood near her abandoned car told its own story. Carla had never been seen again. For James and Grace, the resolution was bittersweet. They now understood the depth of Carla's sacrifice, the lengths she had gone to in order to protect her child. But the final twist came when Claire called James a few days later, her voice hesitant. "James," he said, "there's one more thing you should know. We found DNA evidence in Raymond's cabin. It matches Grace, but not Carla." James froze, the implications hitting him like a tidal wave. Grace wasn't Carla's biological daughter. She had been born into an entirely different life, one that remained a mystery. Carla had saved her not because she was her child, but because she was a mother who couldn't stand to see an innocent life destroyed. When James told Grace, she was stunned, her emotions a whirlwind of gratitude and confusion. But as they sat together, processing everything, James reminded her of one unshakable truth. "You may not know where you came from," he said, "but you know where you belong, and that's here with me." Grace smiled through her tears, gripping his hand tightly. The mystery of her past had brought them to the brink, but it had also cemented the bond they shared, a bond that no twist, no secret, could ever break. The days after the truth came out were a whirlwind of emotions for James and Grace. There was relief in knowing what had happened to Carla, heartbreak over her tragic fate, and lingering questions about Grace's origins. But through it all, they leaned on each other, finding strength in their bond. For Grace, the revelation that Carla wasn't her biological mother only deepened her gratitude for the woman who had sacrificed everything to save her. And for James, it reaffirmed the belief he'd held since the day he found her. Family wasn't about blood, it was about love. Grace decided to honor Carla's memory by learning more about her life. With help from Detective Claire Bennett, they tracked down people who had known Carla, piecing together a portrait of a kind, courageous woman who had been caught in a terrible situation. Grace even visited Carla's old diner, sitting in the same booth where Carla had once served customers, imagining the life she might have lived if things had turned out differently. It wasn't closure in the traditional sense, but it brought Grace a sense of peace, knowing that Carla's bravery had given her the chance to grow up safe and loved. Meanwhile, Raymond Ellis faced justice, with the evidence found in his cabin and witness statements tying him to multiple disappearances. He was charged with several crimes, including Carla's murder. The trial was long and grueling, but James and Grace attended every hearing, determined to see it through. When the verdict was finally delivered, guilty on all counts, there was a collective sense of relief. Raymond would never hurt anyone again, and Carla's story had been brought into the light. But the resolution of the case didn't mean the end of Grace's journey. The revelation that she wasn't Carla's biological daughter left a void in her understanding of who she was and where she came from. James encouraged her to explore those questions at her own pace, reminding her that no matter what she discovered, she would always have a home with him. One day, while sifting through old files at the police department, Grace stumbled upon a small but crucial detail that had been overlooked. It was a hospital record from the night she was found, mentioning an unusual detail about her blanket. It had been handmade, with a unique pattern of embroidered flowers. The report suggested that the blanket might have come from a specific region known for its textile craftsmanship. The discovery reignited Grace's curiosity. She and James began researching the region, diving into its history and cultural traditions. Their search eventually led them to a small group of artisans who recognized the embroidery style as belonging to a family-run workshop. With cautious optimism, they reached out to the family, explaining Grace's story and sharing photos of the blanket. The connection was immediate and undeniable. The blanket had been made by the family years ago, part of a special order for a woman who had been expecting a baby. The family shared what they remembered about the woman who had ordered the blanket. She had been quiet, kind, and deeply excited about her child. But they also recalled that she had left the area suddenly, without explanation, before picking up the rest of her order. Her name, they said, was Amelia. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Grace a new sense of direction. Over the next few months, she and James followed every lead they could find, tracking Amelia's movements and piecing together fragments of her life. The trail was faint, but it eventually led them to a small town where Amelia had lived briefly before disappearing. There, they met a neighbor who remembered her, a young woman with a baby girl, struggling to make ends meet, but determined to provide a better life for her child. The neighbor's description was bittersweet for Grace. It gave her a glimpse of the woman who had brought her into the world, but it also underscored the challenges Amelia had faced. When the neighbor mentioned that Amelia had left her baby in the care of someone she trusted before disappearing, Grace felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Who was that person? And why had they abandoned her in the alley? James reassured her that, regardless of how she'd ended up there, the most important thing was that she had survived. Her resilience, he reminded her, was a testament to her strength and the love she had received along the way. Over time, Grace came to terms with the mysteries that remained. She accepted that she might never know the full story of her early life, but she also realized that her past didn't define her. What mattered was the family she had built with James and the life they had shared together. The questions she had once felt so desperate to answer no longer consumed her. They were pieces of her story, but they weren't the whole picture. As the years went on, Grace channeled her experiences into her art. Her paintings, once vibrant and carefree, took on a deeper, more introspective quality. She began exhibiting her work, using it as a way to explore themes of identity, love, and resilience. Her pieces resonated with others, sparking conversations about the complexities of family and the enduring power of hope. James, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. Watching Grace thrive gave him a profound sense of fulfillment, and he continued to serve his community with the same dedication that had led him to that alley so many years ago. Though his days as a patrol officer were behind him, He remained a mentor to younger officers, sharing the lessons he had learned about compassion and the impact one person could have on another's life. In the end, the story of how James and Grace found each other became a testament to the power of second chances. It was a story of loss and discovery, of sacrifice and redemption, but most of all, it was a story about love, the kind of love that transcends circumstances and shapes the course of a lifetime. As Grace prepared for her first solo art exhibition, she took a moment to reflect on everything that had brought her to that point. She looked at James, who stood by her side, his pride evident in the way he smiled at her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." James shook his head, his eyes glistening. "You don't have to thank me, Grace. You've given me more than I could ever ask for." In that moment, Grace realized that her story wasn't defined by where it began, but by the choices and connections that had shaped her along the way. And as the gallery lights illuminated her work, she knew that her journey, though far from perfect, had been extraordinary. She was a survivor, an artist, a daughter, and most importantly, she was loved.